Commanders involved in this historical event. These are all commanders who appeared throughout this operation. Bullet Operator Major General John B. Wogan, commanding General 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, commanding Officer 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Captain O'Malley, Task Force Commander, C Company, 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Captain Lou Weaver, Company Commander, B Company, 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Lieutenant General Alexander M. Patch, commanding General, U.S. 7th Army. Bullet Operator Colonel Wallace H. Nutting, Chief of Staff, 13th Armored Division. Bullet Operator General Lieutenant Hans Gustav Felber, Commander, German 7th Army. Bullet Operator Major Sheffy, Task Force Commander, 46th Tank Battalion. Bullet Operator Major Feldman, Task Force Commander, 46th Tank Battalion. Time, shortly after midnight, April 10th, 1945. Date, April 10th, 1945. Location, near Diesum, rolling river country east of Hennef, North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany. Weather, cold night, clear skies, temperature near freezing, visibility good under moonlight. Units involved: 46th Tank Battalion, 13th Armored Division, Task Force Delnor, Task Force Sheffy, Task Force Feldman, C Company 67th Armored Infantry Battalion, 124th Armored Engineer Battalion, 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion, 90mm guns, 498th. Field Artillery Battalion. Opposing German forces with concealed 88mm and 20mm AAAC guns. Part 1. The tanks of the 46th Tank Battalion rolled into the assembly area near Hennef just after midnight on April 10, 1945, their crews beyond exhaustion after 2 consecutive days and nights without sleep. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor stood in the turret of his command tank, watching his vehicles navigate the narrow roads in darkness. Headlights masked the thin slits, drivers fighting to stay awake at the controls. The battalion had been in continuous movement since April 8th, first from their staging positions near Moheim and Ruhr, then south through increasingly congested roads filled with military traffic, and finally east toward the Sieg River crossing at Hennef, where engineers had constructed pontoon bridges earlier that evening. This would be the 13th Armored Division's first combat operation, and Delnor's 46th Tank Battalion would lead the advance into what intelligence described as rolling river country east of the Sieg, terrain cut by small streams and covered with patches of forest that could conceal German defensive positions. None of his men had fired a shot in anger. They were green, untested, and about to learn what war actually meant. The orders from Major General John B. Wogan at Division Headquarters in Troisdor had been explicit. Cross the Sieg River at Hennef during the night of April 9 to 10th, advance eastward to the village of Diesum, and secure the high ground beyond to establish a base for further operations into the Ruhr pocket. The 46th Tank Battalion would be organized into task forces for tactical flexibility. Task Force Sheffy and Task Force Feldman, named for their commanders, would advance on parallel routes through the rolling terrain, with infantry support from C Company of the 67th Armored Infantry Battalion and engineers from the 124th Armored Engineer Battalion following to clear obstacles. Artillery support would be provided by the 498th Field Artillery Battalion, positioned west of the Sieg and ready to fire on call. Tank destroyers from the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the new M36 mounting 90mm guns, will provide overwatch and anti-armor support. On paper, it was a well-coordinated combined arms operation. In practice, everything depended on soldiers who had never experienced combat executing complex maneuvers in darkness through unfamiliar terrain against an enemy of unknown strength. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor gathered his company commanders shortly after 0100 hours on April 10th in a farmhouse on the western outskirts of Hennef, spreading maps across a wooden table, while kerosene lamps provided the only illumination. Captain O'Malley, commanding the task force built around C Company, studied the route east toward Diesum, approximately 4 kilometers from their current positions. Captain Lou Weaver, commanding B Company's task force, traced his assigned axis of advance on a parallel route slightly to the north. Both officers looked exhausted, faces showing the strain of 48 hours without real sleep, but their questions were professional and focused. "What do we know about German positions around Diesum?" O'Malley asked. Delnor shook his head. "Intelligence has nothing concrete. Reconnaissance couldn't get close enough without compromising the crossing operation. We have to assume the Germans know we're coming and have prepared defensive positions, but we don't know strength or disposition." It was the eternal problem of armor operations. Sometimes they had to advance into uncertainty and discover the enemy's positions by making contact, which was a professional way of saying someone would get shot at first. The crossing of the Sieg River began at 0147 hours. Sherman tanks rolling across the swaying pontoon bridges one at a time. The engineers who constructed the spans watching nervously as 32 tons of steel stressed their work. The river was not wide at this point, perhaps 50 meters across, but the current was strong from spring runoff, and the bridges flexed noticeably under each tank's weight. Delnor crossed with the lead elements, his command tank moving slowly, treads clanking on the pontoon sections, water visible through gaps in the decking. The eastern bank was quiet, no defensive fire, which would mean the Germans had withdrawn or that they were waiting deeper in the defensive zone. By 0230 hours, the entire 46th Tank Battalion was across the Sieg and forming up in wooded areas east of Hennef, preparing for the advance toward Diesum. The night was cold enough that crew members' breath was visible in the moonlight. A tank commander from one of the lead platoons was smoking a cigarette, the glow briefly visible before he remembered light, discipline, and cupped it in his hands. Everyone was tense, waiting for the order to move, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether their training had been adequate or fatally insufficient. The advance toward Diesum began at 0312 hours on April 10th. Task Force Sheffy and Task Force Feldman moving on parallel routes through the rolling terrain, maintaining radio contact, but unable to provide mutual support due to the intervening ridges and forest patches. The countryside was a patchwork of small farms, hedgerows, and wooded areas typical of Western Germany, terrain that limited visibility and created numerous positions where defenders could establish ambush sites. Sherman tanks moved with infantry squads from C Company of the 67th Armored Infantry, riding on the engine decks despite regulations against it, the soldiers preferring the risk of falling off during sudden maneuvers to the vulnerability of walking in the open. Tank commanders stood exposed in their turrets, binoculars scanning ahead, knowing that buttoning up inside the tank meant losing situational awareness, but that staying exposed meant vulnerability to snipers and artillery fragments. It was a perpetual calculation of armored warfare, balancing protection against awareness, and in combat there was rarely a clearly correct answer. Captain O'Malley's task force was approaching Diesum from the southwest, following a narrow road that curved through farmland before entering the village itself, when the first indication of German presence appeared at 0347 hours. Not incoming fire, but something more subtle. Fresh tracks in the muddy verge beside the road, indicating that vehicles had recently moved through this area. O'Malley halted his column and called forward a sergeant from the infantry company, a veteran of the division's training exercises who had been a farmer in Iowa before the war and understood terrain better than most. The sergeant examined the tracks in the beam of a shielded flashlight, running his fingers through the mud. Heavy vehicles, probably tracked, less than 2 hours old based on a water seepage. Could be tanks repositioning, could be supply vehicles. O'Malley made a tactical decision to proceed, but with increased caution, sending a reconnaissance element ahead while the main body followed at greater interval. It was sound doctrine, the kind taught at armor school, but doctrine assumed you had time and flexibility. The operational schedule demanded they reach Diesum by 0400 and secure it before dawn. Sometimes mission requirements and tactical prudence pointed in opposite directions. The German ambush was sprung at precisely 0353 hours as the lead elements of O'Malley's task force entered the outskirts of Diesum, a small village of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a crossroads where the road from Hennef intersected with a north-south route. The first shot came from concealed positions approximately 200 meters ahead, an 88mm anti-tank gun firing from what appeared to be a prepared emplacement hidden among farm buildings on the eastern edge of the village. The round struck the lead Sherman tank directly on the turret front, penetrating the armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The tank stopped immediately, flames beginning to pour from the hatches. Only 2 crew members escaped, the driver and bow gunner who were positioned lower in the hull. The tank commander, gunner, and loader died instantly, before the column could react. A second 88mm gun opened fire from a different position to the north, destroying another Sherman with a side shot that penetrated the thinner hull armor. The tank brewed up spectacularly, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. Infantry who had been riding on the engine deck were thrown clear by the blast, some wounded, others scrambling for cover in the ditches beside the road. The ambush at Diesum on the morning of April 10, 1945, was a textbook example of German defensive tactics. Concealed anti-tank guns positioned in mutually supporting locations held fire until American armor was committed and vulnerable, then engaged with devastating accuracy at close range where even the relatively weak armor of the Sherman offered no protection. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, O'Malley's task force had lost 2 tanks destroyed and a third damaged by near misses that had disabled its tracks. The infantry squads who had been riding on the tanks were now pinned down in roadside ditches, unable to advance through the fields where German machine guns had clear fields of fire, unable to withdraw because doing so would expose them to the same weapons. Captain O'Malley, observing from his command tank approximately 150 meters behind the lead elements, immediately radioed for artillery support while simultaneously ordering his remaining tanks to deploy off the road and seek cover. The 498th Field Artillery Battalion, positioned west of the Sieg River, received a fire mission at 0355 and had shells impacting around Diesum by 0358, a response time that reflected well-trained crews and pre-registered target coordinates. But artillery alone couldn't suppress well-protected anti-tank guns, especially when the gunners were disciplined enough to cease firing during the bombardment and resume once it lifted. The 88mm guns at Diesum were almost certainly positioned in reinforced emplacements, possibly the famous 88 pits that German forces had been constructing throughout the defensive zones, concrete-lined positions that could withstand anything except a direct hit from heavy-caliber shells. As American artillery pounded the village, raising clouds of smoke and dust that obscured visibility, the German gun crews waited in their protected positions. A tank commander from O'Malley's 2nd Platoon, observing through binoculars from a hull-down position behind a low ridge, caught a glimpse of one of the 88mm positions when muzzle flash briefly illuminated its location during a lull in the artillery fire. He immediately radioed the coordinates to Captain O'Malley, who relayed them to the artillery battalion with a request for precision fire on that specific location. The 498th responded with a time-on-target concentration, multiple batteries firing, so that all shells arrived simultaneously at 0404 hours. The 88mm position took a direct hit and was silenced, but the second gun remained operational. Approximately 3 kilometers north of O'Malley's position, Task Force Feldman was encountering similar resistance near a crossroads outside Diesum, though their engagement developed differently due to terrain variations. Major Feldman's lead tanks had been advancing through more open farmland when they came under fire not from 88mm guns, but from lighter 20mm anti-aircraft guns that the Germans were using in the anti-tank role at close range. The 20mm couldn't penetrate Sherman's frontal armor, but it could damage external equipment, wound exposed crew members, and suppress infantry who were attempting to support the tanks. One of Feldman's tank commanders was hit by 20mm fragments while standing in his turret, suffering severe wounds to his shoulder and arm. The tank's driver, unable to receive commands from the wounded commander, halted the vehicle in the middle of an open field where it became a stationary target. A German Panzerfaust team, concealed in a drainage ditch less than 50 meters away, fired their rocket at the immobilized Sherman. The shape-charged warhead struck the side armor and penetrated, starting an internal fire. The crew evacuated successfully but came under small arms fire while running toward American lines. 1 crew member was killed, 2 wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor, monitoring both task forces from his command position approximately 1 kilometer west of Diesum, was receiving fragmentary reports that painted a confused tactical picture. O'Malley's force was pinned down by at least 1 operational 88mm gun and had lost multiple tanks. Feldman's force had encountered lighter anti-tank weapons and infantry, but was making slow progress through increasingly difficult terrain. Casualties were mounting, At 0412 hours, the battalion medical officer reported 2 men killed and at least 15 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, with more casualties likely as reports continued coming in. The division's first combat engagement was not going according to plan, and Delnor faced a fundamental decision that confronts every battalion commander in a deteriorating tactical situation: commit reserves and try to break through, or consolidate current positions and reassess. The operational schedule demanded forward progress. Tactical reality suggested caution. Delnor chose to reinforce success rather than failure, ordering Captain Lou Weaversby Company to support Feldman's task force, which appeared to be making better progress than O'Malley's pinned-down elements. As dawn began breaking over the rolling countryside east of Hennef around 0545 hours on April 10th, the first day of the 13th Armored Division's combat operations, the situation at Diesum remained contested and confused. American forces held positions on the outskirts of the village but had not yet secured the crossroads that was their objective. German defensive fires had slackened somewhat as artillery continued pounding suspected gun positions, but resistance had not collapsed. The cost of the engagement thus far was significant for a unit experiencing its first combat. 2 men confirmed killed, 25 wounded with several critically, for Sherman tanks destroyed, and 3 more damaged but potentially reparable. These were not catastrophic losses by the standards of armored warfare in 1945, but they represented a harsh introduction to combat for soldiers who had trained for months without ever experiencing the reality of anti-tank guns firing at close range or watching crew members burn to death in disabled vehicles. The psychological impact would prove as significant as the tactical outcome, teaching lessons that no amount of training could replicate about fear, confusion, and the brutal efficiency of well-executed defensive fires against advancing armor. The sun rose fully over Diesum at 0617 hours on April 10th, 1945, revealing the tactical situation in harsh clarity that darkness had previously obscured. Captain O'Malley's task force remained pinned down on the southwestern approaches to the village, 3 destroyed Sherman tanks visible as burning hulks that sent columns of black smoke into the morning sky. The remaining 88mm gun that had survived the artillery bombardment was still operational, positioned somewhere in the village's eastern section, firing periodically to prevent American armor from advancing. O'Malley had deployed his surviving tanks in hull-down positions behind whatever terrain features offer protection: low ridges, farm buildings, a stone wall that ran along one field boundary, but forward movement had stopped completely. Infantry from C Company of the 67th Armored Infantry Battalion were attempting to work through the fields and hedgerows to locate the German gun positions, but they were taking casualties from machine gun fire and sporadic mortar rounds that indicated the Germans had more than just anti-tank guns defending Diesum. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor moved his command post forward at first light, establishing it in a farmhouse approximately 800 meters west of the village, where he could observe the battle developing and communicate more effectively with his task force commanders. From an upper-floor window, using binoculars, he could see the destroyed American tanks, the smoke, and the occasional muzzle flash when the German 88mm fired. He could also see something more troubling: German infantry moving between buildings in Diesum, not retreating but repositioning, which suggested they intended to hold the village rather than conduct a delaying action and withdraw. At 0634, Delnor radioed Major General Wogan at division headquarters in Troisdorf, providing a situation report that acknowledged the battalion had encountered stronger resistance than anticipated and had sustained significant casualties. Wogan's response was direct: "Your priority for artillery and tank destroyer support. Reduce that position and secure Diesum by 0900. We need that crossroads for the continued advance." The operational schedule was unforgiving. The 13th Armored Division's mission required maintaining momentum, which meant Delnor's battalion couldn't afford to spend hours reducing a single village. At 0647 hours, Delnor coordinated a combined arms assault on Diesum involving artillery preparation, tank destroyer overwatch, armor advance, and infantry assault. The 498th Field Artillery Battalion would fire a 15-minute preparatory bombardment on the village, concentrating on the eastern section where the remaining 88mm gun was believed to be positioned. While artillery pounded the German positions, M36 tank destroyers from the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion would move into positions on high ground west of Diesum, using their 90mm guns to engage any German armor or anti-tank guns that revealed themselves. Once the artillery lifted, Sherman tanks from both O'Malley's and Weaver's companies would advance from multiple directions while infantry worked through the buildings, clearing resistance. It was conventional doctrine for reducing a defended village, the kind of operation described in field manuals and practiced during training. The difference was that field manuals didn't capture the chaos, the fear, or the mistakes that inevitably occurred when exhausted soldiers executed complex maneuvers under fire. The artillery preparation began at 0702 hours with stunning violence. Shells from multiple batteries impacted across Diesum in rapid succession. High explosive rounds had detonated among the buildings, collapsing roofs, shattering walls, sending debris flying through the air. A church steeple that had stood for perhaps 2 centuries took a direct hit and toppled sideways, crushing a building below it. Fire started in several locations where incendiary effects ignited wooden structures. German civilians who had remained in the village, sheltering in cellars and basements despite warnings to evacuate, huddled in the darkness while the world above them was systematically destroyed. American forward observers, positioned with the lead infantry elements, adjusted fire based on observed impacts, walking the barrage across the village in a pattern designed to suppress every potential defensive position. By 0715, when the bombardment lifted, Diesum was obscured by smoke and dust, visibility reduced to less than 50 meters in some areas. It was both an advantage and a disadvantage. The smoke concealed American forces advancing, but also prevented them from identifying targets until they were dangerously close. Captain O'Malley led his company's advance personally, his Sherman moving forward at 0717 with 4 other tanks following in tactical formation, while infantry squads moved on foot through the fields on either flank. The approach to Diesum's western edge was across approximately 300 meters of open ground, a killing zone if German anti-tank guns were still operational. But the artillery bombardment appeared to have achieved its purpose. No fire greeted the advancing Americans initially. They covered 100 meters, then 200, turrets traversing constantly, gunners searching through the smoke and dust for targets. At 0721, they entered the village itself, tank treads crushing debris from collapsed buildings, infantry clearing the first structures with grenades and rifle fire. A German soldier, elderly and wearing Volkssturm insignia, emerged from a cellar with his hands raised. An infantry sergeant directed him toward the rear with a gesture. There was no time for processing prisoners during an assault. They would be collected later. The 88mm gun revealed its position at 0724 when it fired at O'Malley's command tank from a range estimated at less than 100 meters, the shot coming from a concealed emplacement in the ruins of what had been a substantial stone building on Diesum's eastern edge. The round struck O'Malley's Sherman on the lower glacis plate at a shallow angle and penetrated, passing through the bow gunner's position and continuing into the fighting compartment. The bow gunner was killed instantly. The driver was severely wounded. O'Malley and his gunner escaped through the turret hatches as the tank began burning. The loader, attempting to exit through the bottom escape hatch, became trapped when the tank settled unevenly on debris and the hatch jammed. He died in the burning vehicle while his crew members, forced to take cover from German small arms fire, could hear his screams but couldn't reach him. It was the kind of death that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The absolute helplessness of watching a friend die meters away and being unable to help. The destruction of O'Malley's command tank should have disrupted the American assault, but Captain Lew Weaver, advancing from the north with the company's task force, had anticipated that resistance would concentrate on the western approach and had positioned his forces to exploit that focus. At 0726, while German defenders were engaging O'Malley's stalled advance, Weaver's Shermans entered Diesum from the northeast, encountering minimal resistance initially. His lead platoon moved rapidly through the northern section of the village, clearing buildings in coordination with infantry, who were becoming more proficient at urban combat with each successive structure. A German machine gun position in an upper floor was suppressed by tank fire that simply demolished the building. A Panzerfaust team attempting to engage from a basement window was killed by infantry grenades before they could fire. By 0734, Weaver's company had advanced through half the village and was approaching the location where the 88mm gun was positioned. though they didn't yet have a clear shot at the emplacement due to rubble and smoke obscuring direct sight lines. The M36 tank destroyers from the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion, positioned on high ground 1,200 meters west of Diesum, had been searching for the 88mm gun throughout the engagement without success. The German crew had been disciplined about not revealing their position unnecessarily, firing only when high-value targets presented themselves, then shifting slightly within their prepared emplacement to avoid counter-battery fire. But at 0738, when the gun fired at one of Weaver's advancing Shermans and missed, the muzzle flash was visible to a tank destroyer commander who had been scanning that sector. He immediately radioed coordinates to his gunner and fired within seconds. The 90mm armor-piercing round crossed the 1,200 meters and struck the stone building that concealed the 88mm position, penetrating the wall and detonating inside the emplacement. The explosion was catastrophic, secondary detonations indicating that stored ammunition for the 88mm gun had been ignited. When the smoke cleared, the building had partially collapsed and there was no return fire. The 88mm gun that had dominated the battlefield for over 3 hours was finally silenced. With the primary anti-tank threat eliminated, American forces secured Diesum rapidly. By 0812 hours on April 10th, infantry had cleared the remaining buildings, captured approximately 30 German soldiers, including several wounded, and established offensive positions on the village's eastern edge. The crossroads that had been the objective was secured at 0819, ahead of General Wogan's 0900 deadline, but at significant cost. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor established a command post in the village center and began the grim process of accounting for casualties and damage. The final tally from the engagement at Diesum was sobering. 2 American soldiers killed in action, 25 wounded with 8 requiring immediate evacuation to rear area hospitals. For Sherman tanks completely destroyed and burning, 3 more damaged but potentially reparable, 1 M36 tank destroyer lightly damaged by artillery fragments. German casualties were estimated at 12 killed and 30 captured, with unknown wounded who had been evacuated before American forces secured the village. The 88mm gun position, when examined after battle, revealed why it had been so difficult to suppress. A concrete reinforced emplacement with overhead protection and multiple firing ports that allowed the crew to engage from different angles without repositioning the gun itself. The psychological impact of Diesum on the 46th Tank Battalion was perhaps more significant than the tactical outcome. These soldiers had trained for combat, had practiced assault drills and combined arms coordination, but training couldn't replicate the experience of watching tanks burn with crew members trapped inside, or hearing wounded men scream for medics while machine gun fire prevented anyone from reaching them, or making the decision to advance knowing that concealed anti-tank guns might be waiting in the next hedgerow. A tank commander from B Company, a lieutenant who had graduated from West Point less than a year earlier, was found sitting on the ground outside Diesum at 0845 hours, hands shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. His crew was unharmed, his tank undamaged, but something had broken inside him during the engagement. The battalion medical officer evaluated him briefly and evacuated him to the rear. He would not return to the battalion. Combat had revealed something about his capacity to function under extreme stress, and the revelation was not favorable. It happened to good soldiers, trained soldiers, and it was nobody's fault except perhaps the fault of war itself. By late morning, around 1045 hours, the 46th Tank Battalion had reorganized at Diesum and was preparing to continue the advance eastward in accordance with division orders. Replacement crews arrived for the damaged tanks. Ammunition was redistributed from supply vehicles that had followed the combat elements across the Sieg River. Wounded had been evacuated through medical channels. The 2 soldiers killed in action, their names would be recorded in morning reports and casualty notifications sent to families in the United States, had been removed from the destroyed vehicles and placed in temporary graves that would later be relocated to military cemeteries. There was no time for formal services or reflection. The operational tempo demanded continued movement. Major General Wogan visited Delnor's command post at 1,117 hours, inspecting the captured German positions and speaking briefly with several tank commanders about the engagement. His assessment was characteristically direct. You did well for a first action. You took casualties, But you completed the mission and learned lessons that will save lives in future engagements. Apply those lessons. It was as close to praise as division commanders typically offered in combat. The lessons learned at Diesum were documented in after-action reports and tactical summaries that would be distributed throughout the 13th Armored Division. Primary lesson: German anti-tank defenses in the Ruhr Pocket remained formidable despite the strategic collapse of organized resistance, with concealed 88mm guns positioned in reinforced emplacements that could dominate approach routes and destroy advancing armor at close range. Secondary lesson: combined arms coordination was essential, with artillery preparation, tank destroyer overwatch, and infantry assault all required to reduce prepared defensive positions without sustaining catastrophic casualties. Tertiary lesson: tank commanders needed to remain constantly aware that visibility and situational awareness required exposing themselves in open turrets, but that exposure made them vulnerable to small arms fire and artillery fragments that could kill or wound them even when their vehicles remained undamaged. These were not revolutionary insights. Armored doctrine had emphasized these points for years, but the difference between understanding doctrine intellectually and learning it through experience was measured in dead soldiers and burning tanks. As afternoon settled over Diesum on April 10, 1945, the village presented a scene of destruction that would become familiar throughout the 13th Armored Division's subsequent operations. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered by artillery, burned-out German and American vehicles scattered across the landscape, and civilians emerging cautiously from cellars to assess what remained of their homes and lives. An elderly German woman stood in what had been her front yard, staring at the pile of broken stone and timber that represented 3 generations of family history. An American soldier from the 67th Armored Infantry, detailed to help clear rubble from the main road, paused to offer her water from his canteen. She accepted without speaking, drank, and returned to staring at the ruins. There would be thousands of similar scenes across Germany in the coming weeks as American armor advanced and German resistance collapsed village by village, town by town. The human cost was never just counted in military casualties. It accumulated in destroyed homes, displaced families, and communities shattered by battles they hadn't asked for and couldn't prevent. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor assembled his surviving company commanders at 1,445 hours for a brief meeting before the battalion resumed its advance. Captain O'Malley was present despite having lost a command tank, now assigned temporarily to another vehicle. Captain Lou Weaver looked exhausted but functional, having been in continuous action since midnight. The other officers showed varying degrees of fatigue and stress. Delnor's guidance was concise. We continue east at 1,500 hours. Expect similar resistance at the next objective. Stay alert, support each other, and remember that the Germans are running out of time and options. We're not. Questions? There were no questions because there was nothing to ask that experience wouldn't answer better than words. At 1,458 hours, the 46th Tank Battalion began moving out of Diesum, leaving behind the damaged vehicles that couldn't be quickly repaired, the temporary graves, and the smoking ruins. The war continued, indifferent to what had been learned or lost. The advance eastward from Diesum resumed at precisely 1,500 hours on April 10, 1945, with the 46th Tank Battalion now reorganized into a more consolidated formation following the morning's costly engagement. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor had restructured his task forces, combining depleted elements and redistributing crews from damaged vehicles to operational Shermans to maintain combat effectiveness. The battalion was smaller now, having lost 4 tanks permanently and having 3 more undergoing field repairs by maintenance crews from the 13th Armored Division Service Company. But the soldiers moving out from Diesum were fundamentally different from those who had crossed the Sieg River at midnight. They had experienced combat, had seen friends killed, had learned in the most direct way possible that German defensive positions were lethal and that mistakes in armored warfare were often measured in burning tanks and dead crew members. That knowledge changed how they moved, how they observed terrain, how they reacted to potential threats. Training created soldiers. Combat created veterans. The terrain east of Diesum continued the pattern of rolling hills, small streams, patches of forest, and agricultural fields that characterized Western Germany's countryside. Intelligence reports indicated that the next significant German defensive positions would likely be encountered near the town of Uckerath, approximately 6 kilometers northeast of Diesum, where road networks converge and terrain features favored defenders. The 46th Tank Battalion's mission was to advance to Uckerath, secure the town, and establish positions that would allow the 13th Armored Division to continue its drive deeper into the Ruhr pocket. The operational plan called for maintaining aggressive forward momentum, giving German forces no opportunity to establish new defensive lines or bring up reinforcements. Speed was critical, but so was avoiding the kind of ambush that had nearly stalled the morning's operation at Diesum. Delnor emphasized to his company commanders the importance of reconnaissance, of not advancing blindly into potential kill zones, of using terrain intelligently rather than simply following roads that might be covered by anti-tank weapons. By 16:30 hours, lead element of the battalion were approaching the outskirts of Uckerath after an advance that had encountered only sporadic resistance, a few rifle shots from distant positions, one brief exchange with German rear guard that withdrew after firing several bursts from a machine gun, scattered evidence of recent German vehicle movements, but no prepared defensive positions. The relative absence of resistance was almost more unsettling than contact would have been, because it suggested the Germans might be concentrating their limited forces for a stronger defensive stand somewhere ahead. Captain Lou Weaver, whose company was leading the advance, halted his column approximately 1,200 meters from Uckerath's western edge and called forward a reconnaissance team to probe the town's approaches before committing his main force. The team consisted of 2 Sherman tanks and an infantry squad mounted in a half-track, with instructions to identify German positions if possible and withdraw immediately if they encountered strong resistance. They moved forward cautiously at 1644, turrets traversing constantly, the infantry dismounted and moving in tactical formation alongside the armor. The reconnaissance team reached Uckerath's outskirts at 1651 without encountering defensive fire, which was itself suspicious. German doctrine typically called for defending towns and villages, particularly those that controlled important road junctions like Uckerath, with at least delaying positions, if not prepared defensive lines. The absence of resistance suggested either that German forces had withdrawn completely, or that they were waiting deeper inside the town, allowing American forces to commit before revealing their positions. The team leader, a sergeant from Iowa whose name was not recorded in available after-action reports, made the tactical decision to enter the town's western edge cautiously, using buildings for cover, searching for signs of German presence. At 1657, approximately 100 meters into Uckerath, the team encountered civilians, elderly men, women, and children who had been sheltering in basements and cellars. Through a combination of hand gestures and limited German language ability, the sergeant learned that German military forces had withdrawn from Uckerath during the previous night, moving northeast toward larger defensive positions closer to Cologne. The town was undefended. Captain Weaver's company entered Uckerath at 1,712 hours after the reconnaissance team confirmed the town was clear of German military presence, and within 30 minutes the entire 46th Tank Battalion had moved through and established positions on the eastern outskirts. For the soldiers who had fought through the morning's engagement at Diesum, Uckerath's unopposed capture was almost anticlimactic, but it demonstrated the inconsistency of German resistance that would characterize operations throughout the Ruhr pocket. Some positions were defended fiercely with concealed anti-tank guns, prepared emplacements, and coordinated fires. Others were abandoned without a fight as German forces withdrew toward positions they considered more defensible or simply disintegrated, as soldiers decided surrender was preferable to continued resistance in a war that was clearly lost. Predicting which situation would prevail at any given objective was nearly impossible, which meant American commanders had to plan for strong resistance at every location while hoping for weak or non-existent opposition. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor established his command post in Uckerath at 1,745 hours and reported to division headquarters that the battalion had secured the town and was in position to continue operations as ordered. Major General Wogan's response, transmitted through division operations channels, directed the 46th Tank Battalion to hold positions in Uckerath overnight, conduct maintenance on vehicles, and prepare for continued offensive operations beginning at 0600 hours on April 11th. The operational pause was welcome news to crews who had been in continuous action or movement since midnight on April 9th and were approaching complete exhaustion. Tank maintenance that had been deferred during the advance could now be conducted, Ammunition could be replenished from supply vehicles that were finally catching up to the combat elements. Hot food could be distributed, the first meal that wasn't cold rations eaten while moving. And perhaps most importantly, soldiers could sleep, though the kind of sleep that follows combat is often troubled by images and sound that don't fade simply because eyes close. As darkness fell over Uckerath around 20-30 hours on April 10th, the 46th Tank Battalion settled into defensive positions around the town's perimeter while maintenance crews worked on damaged vehicles under blackout conditions, using shielded lights that wouldn't be visible to German observers. The sound of the battalion at rest were distinctive. Diesel engines idling on vehicles that were kept running to charge batteries and maintain systems, the clank of tools as crews performed maintenance, quiet conversations among soldiers who were processing their first day of combat, occasional radio traffic as guards reported status and commanders coordinated. In a farmhouse that served as a battalion aid station, medical personnel were treating wounded soldiers who had injuries too minor to warrant evacuation but serious enough to require attention. Burns from touching hot metal inside tanks, cuts from sharp edges during rapid exits from vehicles, bruises and sprains from a violent motion inside armored vehicles moving cross-country at high speed. One soldier was being treated for hearing damage from firing his tank's main gun without proper hearing protection during the intense engagement at Diesum. The human cost of April 10th, 1945, was being calculated throughout the 13th Armored Division as casualty reports were compiled and mourning reports prepared. For the 46th Tank Battalion specifically, the accounting was stark. 2 men killed in action during the Diesum engagement, 25 wounded with 8 evacuated to rear area hospitals for serious injuries and 17 treated and returned to duty. For Sherman tanks completely destroyed, 3 more damaged but undergoing repair. These numbers would be recorded in official histories and after-action reports, reduced to statistics that conveyed tactical outcomes but couldn't capture individual experiences. The tank commander who had escaped from his burning vehicle at Diesum after watching his loader die trapped in a hull, he was counted as unwounded and combat effective because physical injuries were the only kind that appeared in casualty reports. The psychological trauma he carried would manifest later in ways that 1945 military medicine barely acknowledged and certainly didn't treat effectively. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be officially recognized for decades, but the condition existed regardless of whether doctors had a name for it. Captain O'Malley, who had lost a command tank and nearly his life during the morning engagement, gathered the surviving crew members around 2,145 hours in a barn where C Company had established its vehicle park. The crew members, the gunner, driver, and bow gunner who had survived, plus a replacement loader who had joined after the original loader died trapped in the burning tank, sat on the ground while O'Malley spoke quietly about the day's events. He didn't give a speech or offer inspirational words, because nothing about what they'd experienced lent itself to inspiration. Instead, he acknowledged what had happened, confirmed that they would receive a replacement tank in the morning, and told them that they would continue operating together as a crew because trained crews who knew each other's capabilities were more effective than reassigned individuals. It was practical leadership focused on immediate concerns, the kind that soldiers trusted more than grand pronouncements about duty or honor. Before dismissing them, O'Malley added one more thing. What happened to Johnson, the loader who had died in the tank, wasn't anyone's fault. Not his, not ours, not the enemy's. It was war, and war doesn't care about fairness or who deserves to live. Remember him, but don't let it stop you from doing your job tomorrow. The crew members nodded silently and dispersed to get what sleep they could. The night of April 10 to 11, 1945, was relatively quiet in Uckerath, with only sporadic German artillery fire landing several hundred meters from American positions, harassment fires designed to disrupt sleep and keep soldiers on edge rather than concentrated bombardments intended to destroy specific targets. Guard rotations were established, with tank crews alternating between manning defensive positions and resting. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor walked through battalion's positions twice during the night, checking on soldiers, speaking briefly with crew members who were awake, ensuring that defensive preparations were adequate. Around 0245 hours on April 11th, he encountered a young tank driver, barely 20 years old, sitting beside his Sherman and staring at nothing in particular. Delnor sat down beside him and asked if he was all right. The driver nodded but didn't speak for several moments. Finally, he said quietly, "I keep seeing that tank burning at Diesum, the one where the guy was trapped. I can still hear him screaming." Delnor had no easy answer, because there wasn't one. He replied simply, "I know. I hear it too. But we have a job to do tomorrow, and the day after, until this war ends. Focus on that. Focus on your crew, your tank, your mission. The other things you deal with them later when there's time." It was insufficient, but it was honest, and sometimes honesty was all Commander could offer. Dawn on April 11, 1945, arrived with overcast skies and temperatures that remained near freezing, typical spring weather in western Germany. The 46th Tank Battalion began preparing for the day's operations at first light, around 0545 hours, with crews performing final checks on vehicles, loading ammunition, conducting radio tests, and receiving briefings on the day's mission. The operational plan called for battalion to advance northeast from Uckerath toward the larger town of Seedberg, approximately 12 kilometers distant, where significant German resistance was expected based on intelligence reports. The pace would be aggressive, with the objective of covering the distance by midday and securing Seedberg by late afternoon. It was an ambitious schedule that reflected Major General Wogan's determination to maintain momentum and prevent German forces from establishing coherent defensive lines. At 0558 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Delnor transmitted the order to move out, and the battalion's remaining tanks began rolling eastward from Uckerath in tactical formation, their crews now veterans with 1 day of combat experience behind them and an unknown number ahead. The advance towards Seedberg on April 11th encountered resistance that was heavier and more coordinated than the scattered opposition near Uckerath, but lighter than prepared defenses at Diesum. German forces were conducting fighting withdrawals, establishing temporary defensive positions, engaging American armor at range, and then withdrawing before they could be flanked or overwhelmed. This was professional military conduct by soldiers who understood that the war was lost strategically, but who continued following orders and executing doctrine, because that was what discipline and training demanded. Captain Lou Weaver's company engaged a German rearguard position near the village of Stahlberg at 0847 hours, exchanging fire with what appeared to be a reinforced infantry platoon supported by a single anti-tank gun, possibly a towed 75mm PK-40. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes before the Germans withdrew, having inflicted no casualties on the American forces, but having delayed their advance by nearly an hour while the position was reduced with artillery support and flanking maneuvers. By early afternoon on April 11th, around 1330 hours, the 46th Tank Battalion was approaching Seedberg from the southwest and encountering increasingly dense urban terrain as they transitioned from rural countryside to the industrial suburbs that surrounded larger German cities. Seedberg itself was a town of approximately 20,000 inhabitants before the war, with factories, railway connections, and residential areas that would present significant challenges for armored operations. Urban combat reduced the advantages of tanks. Their mobility was constrained by narrow streets, their long-range gunnery capabilities were irrelevant at close quarters, and their vulnerability to short-range anti-tank weapons like Panzerfaust increased dramatically. Lieutenant Colonel Delnor coordinated closely with supporting infantry from the 67th Armored Infantry Battalion to ensure that tank infantry teams were properly organized for urban operations, with infantry clearing buildings ahead of armor and tanks providing fire support from positions that minimize exposure to close-range threats. The battle for Seedberg developed throughout the afternoon and evening of April 11th, with American forces gradually clearing the western and southern sections of the town against resistance that varied from building to building. Some structures were undefended, their German military occupants having withdrawn hours earlier. Others were fortified positions where Hitler Youth or Volkster militia fought with fanatical determination until they were killed or wounded too severely to continue. The 46th Tank Battalion supported the infantry assault with direct fire against fortified positions, the Sherman 75mm guns demolishing buildings that concealed German defenders, but the battalion suffered additional casualties during the urban fighting. One tank was destroyed by a Panzerfaust team firing from a basement window at less than 20 meters range, the shape-charged warhead penetrating the side armor and killing 3 crew members. Another tank was disabled by a German mine that had been hastily placed in a street, blowing off its right track and road wheels but leaving the crew uninjured. By nightfall on April 11th, approximately half of Seedberg was secured, but German forces still held the eastern portions of the town and showed no signs of immediate collapse. The fighting in Seedberg continued through April 12th and into April 13th before the town was finally secured, representing the 46th Tank Battalion's most sustained engagement since entering combat 3 days earlier. The cumulative casualties from Seedberg added to those from Diesum created a significant personnel deficit that would require replacements from division reserves. More importantly, the experience of urban combat provided lessons that would prove valuable in subsequent operations as the 13th Armored Division advanced through increasingly built-up terrain toward the industrial cities of the Ruhr. Soldiers learned to clear buildings systematically, to coordinate tank infantry operations in confined spaces, to recognize the signatures of Panzerfaust ambush positions, and to maintain discipline and cohesion, even when fighting became fragmented into dozens of small unit actions spread across a chaotic urban battlefield. These were skills that couldn't be taught in training camps. They could only be learned through experience, and the price of that education was measured in casualties that accumulated day by day, engagement by engagement. On April 14, 1945, for days after the 46th Tank Battalion's first combat engagement at Diesum, the battalion was temporarily withdrawn from frontline operations for maintenance, reorganization, and integration of replacement personnel and vehicles. The 4 days of continuous combat had reduced the battalion's effective strength significantly through casualties and mechanical attrition, and commanders recognized that units pushed beyond their sustainable limits became progressively less effective and more prone to catastrophic failures. The battalion moved to rear areas near Bonn, approximately 20 kilometers west of their last combat positions, where maintenance facilities and replacement depots were established. New Sherman tanks arrived to replace those destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Replacement crews joined battalion, young soldiers fresh from training in the United States who were immediately identifiable by their clean uniforms and lack of the exhausted, hollow-eyed look that characterized soldiers who had been in sustained combat. Veterans regarded the replacements with a mixture of sympathy and detachment, knowing that some would adapt and survive, while others would not, and that there was no reliable way to predict which would be which until combat revealed the answer. The statistical record of the 46th Tank Battalion's first 4 days of combat operations, April 10 to 13, 1945, documented the cost of transforming untested soldiers into combat veterans. Total casualties: 7 men killed in action, 43 wounded with 18 requiring extended hospitalization, 2 missing and later confirmed as prisoners of war. Vehicle losses: 9 Sherman tanks completely destroyed, 14 damaged but returned to service after repair, 3 abandoned due to mechanical failures in positions that couldn't be recovered safely. These numbers represented approximately 15% casualties in personnel and 20% losses in combat vehicles over 4 days of operations, rates that were sustainable for short periods but would lead to complete unit exhaustion if maintained indefinitely. The lessons learned were incorporated into tactical doctrine, training emphasized, and after-action reports distributed throughout the division. But the most profound lessons about fear, courage, the randomness of death, and the psychological cost of killing and watching friends die, those couldn't be reduced to statistics or captured in official reports. They remained individual burdens carried by soldiers who had learned at Diesum and Seedberg what it meant to be at war. What does it take to transform untested soldiers into combat-effective veterans in less than a week of sustained operations? How much of combat effectiveness derives from training versus the hard lessons learned through actual engagement with an enemy who is trying to kill you? When examining the 46th Tank Battalion's experience at Diesum, what stands out is not just a tactical outcome, a village captured, objective secured, but the human cost of that learning process and the speed with which soldiers either adapted to combat's demands or were broken by them. Does historical memory adequately honor units whose first engagements were late in the war, when strategic victory was already assured but tactical combat remained as deadly as ever, and when those soldiers returned home after the war, carrying memories of burning tanks and trapped crew members in villages destroyed and lives ended in moments of violence? What do they make of society that celebrated victory but had no framework for understanding what that victory had cost individuals who secured it? These questions matter because they remind us that every unit's first day of combat, regardless of when it occurs in a war's chronology, represents an irreversible transformation for the soldiers who survive it, a crossing from one kind of existence to another, with no possibility of return to what was before.